Whigs, Federalists, Know-Nothings, Bull Moose. Hot new musical groups? Popular brands of casual wear? Not quite. The names of political parties that have played a role in American political history. With the prominence of the Democratic and Republican parties today, it's hard to believe that there was no plan for a party system when this country first began. In fact, America's early leaders deeply distrusted the whole idea of political parties.
Partisanship in the early republic was thought to be inevitable, but was expected to be contained because it would be so fragmented, because there would be so many different factions that no one faction could survive. And the early generation of Americans, of United States citizens, was quite surprised, in fact, when parties emerged in the early republic. The Federalists and the Republicans of the late 18th century.
These parties emerged during George Washington's administration. Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists promoted a strong national government and business interests. The Jeffersonian Republicans supported states' rights and small landholders.
Each of them believed that they were the legitimate spokesman for what the nation represented, and neither of them believed in the legitimacy of the other. And that remained the case through the first 30 to 40 years of our national history until in the 1820s and 30s a modern conception of party emerged in which each party considered the legitimacy of the other and even began to believe that there was a value in having party competition, that it would be another part of the checks and balances that made American democracy stable.
By this time, the Federalists had lost power, and the Republican Party had split into two camps over policy differences: the Republicans and the Democrats led by Andrew Jackson. These parties bore little resemblance to their successors.
It's one of the more remarkable and interesting features of American history that the Republicans and Democrats have actually switched sides on the issues of a stronger national government vis-a-vis the states. And from the time of Lincoln until the 1930s, the Republicans, of course we typically forget this today, but it was the Republican Party that was the party of nationalism.
That's what they came in with. Under Lincoln, for example, he said we wanted a new birth of freedom. He meant not merely the elimination of slavery and civil rights for blacks. The Republicans were the great positive reformers of the post-Civil War and early 20th century. And they put through things like Homestead Act, enabling people to take land. The transcontinental railroads, crucially important. Tariff reforms, grants for higher education, the Aggie colleges.
So the Republicans believed in an active government in many important respects in the 19th century, whereas the Democrats, who had their base of support in the South that of course had attempted to secede from the Union, and after the Civil War became the so-called Solid South, the region of the country that could be counted on to vote Democratic heavily in almost every election for nearly 100 years.
The real change came then with Hoover, whom everyone expected to be sort of the great engineer, but he resisted. And, of course, when Roosevelt came in, the Republicans immediately took up this position of opposition to federal action. And here you see the Democrats taking up the posture, the public philosophy, if you like, of their old enemies.
And it occurred in main part, I suppose, because of the leadership of Franklin Roosevelt and his building of a new Democratic coalition, a national majority Democratic coalition based on the Solid South, was an important member, but so was the industrial North, immigrants, labor unions, and increasingly a larger segment of minorities were embraced as part of the New Deal coalition. So the Democratic Party went from being the minority party, as it was for most of the period after the Civil War until the 1930s, to becoming the majority party in American politics. And the Republican Party became the party of localism, the areas and segments of the population that had misgivings about this growth of national government, and it assumed the position of opposition to the national party.
After World War II, a lot of the political science literature showed that there was more or less a kind of stable party system in the United States, and that most Americans sort of were partisans. But what that meant varied tremendously across the country. To be a Democrat in New York City was fundamentally different from being a Democrat in Alabama. But people nevertheless stuck to their parties. We then had a tremendous revolution in the American party system starting around the 1960s. And it happened when there were the big changes in the South mostly, where African Americans in the South got the vote. The Democratic Party became closely identified with the racial issue as the supporter of black rights. The Republican Party took a more conservative position on that issue, and you got this major change in Southern politics, where all of a sudden the South, the white South in particular, moved toward the Republican Party.
So the civil rights split the Democrats. Lyndon Johnson signs the civil rights bill and says, I've consigned the South to the Republican Party for the next generation. The Vietnam War splits the Democrats and some Republicans. There's new rise of social issues having to do with the acceptable bounds of social behavior, abortion, gay rights, the women's liberation movement, which raise new issues that the old party system didn't encompass, and that separate people from their parties or make it hard for them to figure out which party is their party.
So parties evolve. This is not unnatural. Both parties have been evolving over time. There's no question the Republican Party has gone farther to the right over the last 25 years.
And I'm going to keep this party pro-life.
And there's no question that the activists in the Democratic Party have gone farther to the left. And it has left a great number of Americans who don't share all of those views, feeling somewhat without a home.
Where there is a dramatic difference between the two parties as compared to the American people is in their activists. That is, the people that run the Democratic Party, start with them, the people that are active in the Democratic Party are more liberal than their candidates, and they're more liberal than the American public.
Pharmaceutical companies, the HMOs, sometimes you have to be willing to stand up and say no.
Conversely, the people that are activists within the Republican Party are far to the right of the American people in general, and even of many Republicans. They are the people that are most interested in politics. They have a passion for politics. They often have a passion for ideas. They become fervently in love with the idea of minimum government or free markets, so on and so forth. And so they take these very strong views that most Americans don't endorse.
I'm someone who obviously feels as a moderate and who, for example, has voted frequently for Republican candidates, and yet I'm very insistently pro-choice. As the Republican Party has moved right, I sense that has left me moving left on domestic issues. I'm farther away from the mainstream of the Republican Party. And I think that's true of a lot of people. I don't feel alone in that.
In order to best represent my state of Vermont, my own conscience and principles I have stood for my whole life, I will leave the Republican Party and become an independent.
There's this larger free-floating segment of the population now that doesn't feel it has a natural home in either party.
If some people don't feel at home in either of the two major parties, why isn't there a strong third party to fill the gap?
There have been third parties or parties beyond the first two parties for much of American history. All of them have been flops.
We have this first past the post system, as they sometimes describe it. It's really more technically the single-member plurality district system, which means you win office if you come in first. And when you think about a congressional race, you have to have a lot of votes to come in first. And you can have a third party that's strong nationally. Let's say it gets 20% of the votes in a national election, and they're spread evenly across the country. How many seats in Congress does it get? It gets 0. In
the parliamentary systems in Europe and Canada and the British Commonwealth, you don't elect the prime minister. Either you vote for a member of parliament like Congress in your constituency, that's what they do in Canada or Britain, or you vote nationally in a proportional representation election where each party nominates people and they get the same proportion of members of parliament that they get in the vote.
The virtue is that a lot of people can have their voices heard in the legislature. In our case, if you don't feel represented by one of the two parties, it's difficult for you to be heard. But the flip side of that is that when our election ends, you know which party is going to form the government. It's the Republicans or the Democrat. And so there's a direct correspondence between the votes cast and the government that results. In most parliamentary democracies, after the election ends, there's still some uncertainty because the parties then have to do a subsequent round of negotiations to determine who's going to be in government. So on the one hand, your party might have representatives, but on the other hand, the relationship between the vote you cast and the government that actually makes the laws that you live under may be very hard to predict even on the day of the election.
There have been times in our nation's history when third parties have affected the outcome of an election.
We have two dominant parties who erect high statutory barriers to get on the ballot by third party and fourth party.
If a third party takes disproportionately from one party rather than the other, they can be decisive. It's extremely rare for that to happen, however, in a national election. It's a very unusual situation.
A third party of the left or the right is a real hindrance to its best friends. A vote for a third party of the left is a vote for the right wing, period, end of story. Conversely, that is true for the right. A right-wing party helps elect liberals. This point does not hold for Perot's party because it was a centrist party and it was taking from both sides.
It's ironic that, Ross Perot got 19% of the vote in 1992 and didn't affect anything. And Ralph Nader got 2.7% of the vote in 2000 and determined the outcome of the election. It's a winner-take-all electoral process. And if it's a close election, you have to make a choice. Do you vote for the man you prefer, or do you vote for the lesser of the two evils of the ones who actually have a chance?
Nader's probably not going to win, so, I mean, my vote, if I do vote for Nader, will be more symbolic than anything else.
You know, in the Ralph Nader candidacy in the 2000 election, that 3% that Nader took nationally were primarily votes that would have gone to Al Gore, which could have changed the outcome of the 2000 election.
I think particularly of all the people that signed ads for Ralph Nader, I think that this shows that they have no respect for the realities of how the American political system works. So imagine if somebody with Ralph Nader's ability and courage had run in Democratic Party primaries. Nader, of course, would have lost, but he would have accumulated some delegates, and they would have had to give him a chance to speak on national television, at which point he could have criticized all the corporations, presented his alternative plan, and then suggested everybody vote for Al Gore. And at the same time, he probably would have ended up an appointee in that government. Now he's made it so that it's unlikely that any Democrat would ever appoint any Nader-related person to a government position.
So sometimes third parties can kind of upset the balance between the two parties by pulling more votes away from one of the two than the other, and in a close election making a difference. The other function that third parties historically have had, and that's to essentially bring issues into the agenda that the two major parties, they never ignore these issues, but they're not paying enough attention to them. They're too difficult for them to deal with. And when a third party does that and succeeds with that kind of an issue, that's a wake-up call to the two major parties. And one or the other of them is likely to try to co-opt, take that issue on. And, that's what third parties do in our system. They don't win, but they sometimes make a difference.
Elections are won in the center. And so both parties have to compete for that center. The Republican right wing, I think, is a much more potent force and problem also for the Republicans than the, quote, liberal left wing is for the Democrats. Clinton's political brilliance coming 4 years after the Dukakis debacle was really to reposition the Democrats as a viable centrist party.
Americans instinctively are very moderate. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, almost routinely, about 50% of all voters when they went to the polls on election day said that they were moderates. Maybe 30% would be conservative, 20% would be liberal. That number has held up throughout the last two decades pretty well.
The way our two-party system works, you have to go for that middle voter. You have to find that voter that gives you 50% plus one. And when you're reaching for that, you've got to moderate. Now, sometimes you're just a wolf in sheep clothing by by talking smooth or being nice or saying a few words in Spanish.
Pues voy a hablar en inglés.
But generally, I think that the way the system works, it does conduce towards bringing in people with moderate temperaments into the political arena. That is, I think it's very hard to go around to coffee after coffee, fundraiser after fundraiser, rubber chicken banquet after rubber chicken banquet, and totally fib about what you believe. That is, you have to have a moderate bone in your body to pose as a moderate. So in that sense, the system is very conducive towards centrism.
The fact that both parties are competing for large blocks of voters does not alter the fact that there are ideological differences between the two.
Today, and this is a great oversimplification, the political parties are more homogeneous in terms of one being more to the left and one being more to the right.
They used to be much more diverse ideologically. In the Republican Party, there used to be what were known as even moderate or liberal Republicans that have since disappeared since the 1960s. The Democratic Party had been a coalition of Northern liberals and Southern conservative Democrats, so that now we actually have a more ideologically coherent conservative type Republican Party and a more ideologically coherent overall on average liberal Democratic Party, with some substantial debate within the Democratic Party about whether it should be in fact a more moderate party than that some of the liberals in the party want it to be.
Democrats basically have looked at the government as the place from which we create things, and that's why we were in power so long. I mean, we came in the middle of the Depression when the country was flat on its back. People couldn't do it for themselves, and we created all those organizations, Social Security and Medicare and welfare, and all these things have been created by Democrats who believe that you use the governmental system to deal with problems that people can't deal with themselves.
The Republican Party's gone through a lot of transformations. It was at one time during the Robert Taft days, it was much more a Wall Street business-oriented kind of republicanism. It became, because of the Cold War and all, became very much a military-oriented kind of conservatism. Then it became kind of a social activist conservatism, the rise of the religious right, much more emphasis on moral and spiritual values as what were the critical dimensions. That has sort of faded too. All of these things tend to rise and fade.
Delegates and my fellow citizens, I pray.
George W. Bush, in his campaign, talked a lot about the things that I felt should characterize the Republican Party. And that is emphasizing the ways in which conservative principles are compassionate, can help people.
But do these differences become blurred in party efforts to win the majority of votes?
Parties are often underestimated in the press and also by some scholars. In fact, partisanship is alive and well in the public. That the last couple of elections have been the most party line elections that we've seen really in 20 or 30 years, maybe longer. And that's because as the parties have polarized, they've clarified the choice for voters.
Yes, I voted straight Democratic.
And why is that?
Why is that? Because I think Al Gore is equipped, and I think Bush and Gore are.
Straight Republican.
Why is that?
Because I thought they were the best candidates and I believed in their issues.
You know what you're getting with a Republican or a Democrat now. You know what side they are on most of the issues. And that clarity allows voters to decide where they belong, which party is theirs.
The presidential elections, is there a better example than the year 2000? You can say the center is divided or that both parties are competitive in the center. And I think it's more of the latter. But precisely because it's so close, the struggle to have become sharply differentiated in people's minds, that Democrats stand for this and Republicans stand for this, is, I think, where the war is.
Party officials, as well as researchers, track the voting behavior of groups, election to election, year after year.
The population that was really interesting in 92 was the Asian American vote, which is all of these groups. Now we're talking about Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Filipinos. But as a group, voted for Bush, the father, in 92. Clinton made some inroads in 96, but still a majority voted for the Republican candidate Dole in 96. In 2000, 61% of Asian Americans voted Democratic in this last election. So clearly the Democrats have made inroads in populations that had more of an independent streak than blacks. Now clearly blacks' movement to the Democratic Party took place over 100 years. I mean, we're not talking about, you know, they woke up one morning and said, aha, we're Democrats. We're talking about 100 years of push by the Republican Party of blacks out, and kind of minimal pull in some instances on the part of the Democratic Party.
In the 2000 election, blacks voted 90 to 95% in different areas of the country for Gore. Latinos vote heavily Democratic, although Cubans in Florida actually split more Republican. There's some gender gap in the elections. Women tend to break a little more Democratic and men a little more Republican.
What about people who register as independents? Are their numbers becoming more significant?
Among the people who vote, there's only a very small proportion who are true independents, 5-6%, maybe 7%. The rest are either partisans or lean toward a party, and those who tell a pollster that they lean toward a party are just as loyal to that party as are those who say that they're mild partisans. So in fact, something on the order of over 90% of the people who actually cast a vote are in fact pretty consistent partisans. So the number of independents is not large. Now, in a very closely balanced electorate, those independents make all the difference.
If you know someone's party identification, you know, that's always the key. But of course, a lot of ethnic and socioeconomic characteristics of people lead them to choose one party or another. But it's still the case that most people are Democrats or Republicans, and most people who call themselves Democrats vote for Democrats almost all of the time, and the same for Republicans.
But for all this partisan support, political parties are relatively weak in this country. They still recruit candidates, raise money, develop policy positions, but they don't control these activities as they once did. For instance, candidates can bypass the parties and win nomination through primaries and caucuses.
Throughout most of the 20th century, there were no primaries. There were party conventions where the party leaders from all the different areas of the country got together and they fought it out. And they went to a smoke-filled room and they didn't emerge until they had one person as the candidate. Now, a lot of people felt excluded from that process in both parties, and that led to a demand for primaries. And so primaries were seen as opening up the process.
In the old days, the candidates would in fact use the party as a basis of support, visibly in their campaign. Nowadays, party support may be implicit, but it becomes less of the kind of thing that candidates raise in the course of their campaigns.
It certainly is true in my experience that we went from being much more party-centered to politician-centered politics in the course of the 1970s, 80s, and into the 90s. I think that television was part of the reason. I think the way in which people began to concentrate on character and on personality and on the nature of a person as opposed to what their program or their substantive program would be had something to do with it too. It's a little hard if your political measurement is on what kind of person is running for office rather than what they would do if they got into the office. You have a much different way of measuring people, and party becomes less important.
What are we doing? That's not the party we believe. Not the party of Ronald Reagan.
Of course, not all candidates ignore their party connection.
It can help candidates in raising money. When individual candidates run for office, other members of their party, other government officials and elected people in elected office can come and help them campaign. The party has its own money that it can provide candidates. The party leaders become very important in organizing the party's own positions and debates about issues, both in Congress and the Senate.
My friend Paul Tully, a great Democratic strategist, once said that the party is the glue that holds different constituencies together. It's the institutional way in which different groups of people who believe a certain way hold themselves together. How do you weigh the different interest groups of a society and form a majority and allow a majority to govern, but not to govern ruthlessly against the interests of a minority? That's the great American experiment, and a critical element of that has always been the way in which we use the institutional structure of a political party to hold those factions together.
On Common Ground, Framework for Democracy is a 26-part series about American government. For more information on this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.